Hey, what's up guys? Joel Adams with Iridesium, and I am back with another tutorial. Today we're going to be cranking up the heat, taking a look at making some lava in Blender. In this tutorial, I'm going to be demonstrating the power of ambient occlusion maps and how useful they can be in creating believable materials, as this is primarily how we create the lava material. In this tutorial, we're going to be modeling the lava waves with geometry and then applying some displacements to sculpt in the detail. And then after that, we're going to be adding in the material. So no lava fluid simulations yet. So anyways, with that being said, let's jump right in and get started with the tutorial. I'm going to open up a new scene in Blender and add in a plane. Here I'm going to go to the top view. Then I'm going to select two vertices on the side of the plane, and I'm going to control and left click. This will automatically extrude out the vertices you have selected to the point you clicked. After drawing out my shape on the X and Y axes, I'm going to extrude the shape a little bit along the Z axis, grab the top front row of vertices and drag that up. Add in a loop cut right here on the wave and drag it down to the very bottom. Deselect that loop cut and then drag the very bottom vertice on this mesh back underneath, just tucking it in a little bit. I'll add in one more loop cut, just tightening up the back of this shape. Then I'm going to switch to top view again, select everything and duplicate this mesh. I'll drag it out and rotate it to just create a second wave. Repeat this step a couple of times and that will give you your basic base mesh. Then turn on proportional editing with the O hotkey and just grab some vertices and drag them around, warping the mesh out of shape so that it doesn't look like we just duplicated this object over and over again. Basically, I'm just randomizing the shape as a whole a little bit so that it's not obvious we duplicated one mesh. Now tab back into object mode and you should have your base mesh. I'm going to crank up the subdivision surfaces by hitting Ctrl 2. Next, it's time to begin adding displacement modifiers. The first displacement that I'm going to add is going to be clouds. I'll crank up its size a little bit and then turn down the strength as well. This first displacement is just to randomize the shape of our base mesh so that it's not too flat and smooth. This will give us a better foundation to build our more detailed displacements on top of. Next, I'm going to delete the geometry that is not being seen by the camera. So for this, I'm going to need a little bit extra geometry in edit mode. To get this extra geometry, I'm just going to duplicate the subdivision surface we have right now and hit apply on it. This will give me more geometry to work with. I'm going to duplicate this mesh and move it to a trash layer somewhere just in case we ever have to revert back to this step. Then I'm going to tab into edit mode and hit Z to go into wireframe. I'm going to select everything that is in the field of view of the camera. I will invert my selection and then hit X and delete all the faces. This will allow us to have a higher resolution mesh without bogging the scene down with extra vertices that aren't being rendered. Make sure before you do this that you have your camera angle decided on permanently, as after you delete the vertices you will not be able to move your camera very much. Next, I'm going to add another displacement modifier. I'm going to go to the textures tab and choose marble for this displacement. In order to control the marble texture, I'm going to need to add in an empty, pull it out so that it is not inside the mesh. Then select the marble mesh and I will change the marble displacement's texture coordinate setting to object, and then I will select the empty to be the target object. I'm going to turn the strength down on the marble displacement. Once you've done this, you can manipulate your empty, rotate, translate, and scale to get your waves to map on your mesh the way you want them. For this lava, you are going to need to map your marble texture so that it runs the same way the waves you modeled run. Next, I'm going to go back to our marble settings and I'm going to change the marble type to be sharper and just leave the wave type as sine. Next, I'm going to turn up the turbulence and the depth a little bit. The turbulence will just make sure that the marble texture is not perfectly smooth. It will break up the pattern a little bit. I'll turn the strength for this displacement down to 0.1, and then I'll add another displacement modifier. I'll just real quick turn off the subdivision surface so some of the settings are a little quicker and more responsive. This displacement we just created, I'm going to choose clouds, and I'm going to make their noise type hard. Then I'll turn their strength to something like 2 or 3, and also select Voronoi F2. Next, I'll switch back to the modifiers tab, turn that displacement to 0.1, and then turn our subdivision surface back on so that we can see the effect that that hard cloud displacement has on our mesh. Just remember that if the displacements and the settings I am using are not working for you, feel completely free to go off from the tutorial and do your own experimentation. Next, I'm going to delete as much more of the geometry as I can. I'm going to tab into edit mode again, and without going into wireframe, I'm going to select all the vertices in view of the camera, and then just like before, I'm going to invert the selection and delete everything. Next, I will tab back into object mode, hit Shift Z in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and add in a sun lamp. I'm just going to rotate this so it's kind of coming in directly from the right of the camera, and give ourselves a nice balance between light and shadow. Then I'm going to go back into edit mode on the mesh, and I'm going to clean it up a little bit, just deleting some of the floating geometry pieces that we have around, and making sure we have as much of the geometry as possible deleted. I'm going to turn the subdivision surface back on so we can see things a little better. Then I'm going to turn up the sun lamp to something like 5. I'm going to go under tools and turn the object's shading type to smooth. Then I'm going to add in an environment texture. Just grab whatever so that you can get some color in your shadows, just so that it's not, flat gray. Next, I'm going to change our main window into a node editor, and I'm going to hit new material on the lava object. This image texture is going to be the ambient occlusion map, which we are going to bake. I'm going to split the main view and change the one on the right to a UV image editor. I'll add a new image by going down to image and hitting new image. I'll just call this one AO and hit OK. I should have actually gone with 4096 by 4096, and so if I was you, I would start with something higher res. Next, I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to select everything and hit U to do cube project, and then hovering over the UV image editor, I hit Control A and Control P to average the island size and then pack them. Next, I'm going to go back to the 3D view and select our lava object again, adding a few more displacements. I'm going to add in another displacement modifier, hit new texture. I initially changed it to Voronoi, but ended up changing it to clouds. I'm going to set its noise size down to 0.1 or something like that, and then change it to clouds. I'm going to choose Voronoi Crackle for the noise basis. Then I will go back to the modifiers tab and turn the strength down a little bit so that our mesh isn't, totally destroyed by this displacement modifier. I'll go with 0.05 for now, and then I'll go back to the texture settings and turn it up just a little more. Then I will very quickly turn off that subdivision surface, and here I'm going to paint in a very basic weight map, just a couple of splotches here and there. Then under the vertex group of this Voronoi Crackle cloud displacement, I will select the vertex group we just painted. Turning the subdivision surface back on, you can see that the Voronoi Crackle has only been added to some areas and not others, making the whole object look, I think, a little more believable. And right now, I'm just going to change the render settings for this subdivision surface all the way up to 6, so that we can get as much detail as possible when we bake this ambient occlusion map. Then I'm going to turn down the viewport setting for this subdivision surface and adjust some of the displacements before I bake the ambient occlusion map. And then I'll go to the render settings and turn the samples down to 16. Then under the bake settings, I'm going to change the bake type to ambient occlusion, and then go ahead and hit bake. However, I forgot to select our AO map in the node editor on this material, so I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. And this is the bake I got. It is an ambient occlusion map, which basically means the cracks are colored in black and the protruding areas are all white. If you have Node Wrangler enabled, you can Control-Shift-Click on your image texture, and this will allow you to view your ambient occlusion map. And viewing that right away, it is obviously too low resolution. So back in the UV image editor, I am adding a new image, which I title AO002, and make it 2048 by 2048. After hitting OK on that, it should give me another plain black image, which I can then again select in the node editor and hit bake on. And this is what I got from that bake. It is higher resolution and better looking, however, it is not high enough. Next, I'm going to switch back to the node editor, and I'm going to switch out our default diffuse shader for a principal shader. I will plug this into the material output and then just turn the color value down quite a bit so that we have a darker material. This principal shader is basically just going to be the lava rock that has sort of cooled off a bit. Next, I will turn up the metallic a little bit and then add in a Musgrave texture. Change it to multifractal. Then I'll turn the scale to 3, the detail to 16, the dimension to 0, and then I will start the lacudinary at 2. This Musgrave texture is going to just add some fine-grained detail to the cooled part of our lava rock. Then I'll turn the lacudinary down just a little bit. I'll leave it at 0.6 for now. Then I will add in a bump node, plug the Musgrave texture into the height of the bump node, and plug the bump node into the normal on the principal shader. I'll turn the strength down for the bump map to 0.45 or something like that for now. And then I'm going to add in a mix shader, put this in between the material output node and the principled shader. I'll add in an emission shader and plug this into the bottom of the mix shader. Plug the ambient occlusion texture into the mix shader's FAC value. Then I'm going to select a reddish color for the emission shader and add in a color ramp in between the ambient occlusion texture and the mix shader. I'll just flip the colors around. This will make it so that the emission shader is in the cracks and crevices, and the principal is on the areas that are pushed out. I'll turn up the contrast just a little bit on this color ramp and then add in a second one. The first color ramp is going to control what parts of the shader are emissive, and the second one is going to control the color for the emissive part of our shader. So on this second color ramp, I'll begin painting in the colors of the lava. For the value furthest on the right, I'll just choose a red, and for the value furthest on the left, I'll just choose a bright yellow for now. And then I will plug this color ramp into the emission shader's color. And then once you've got this basic setup, you can adjust your color ramps to get your lava painted the color that you want it, and painted where you want it. So anyways, I'm just going to paint in some basic colors here and then prepare for a render. I'm going to switch back to the UV image editor. I'm going to change the samples back to 32 and then hit render to do our first test render. This is what we got from that render. It doesn't look very good yet, but we're not quite done. Next, we're going to just do some tweaking. I'm going to scale down the empty to make our waves a little smaller. Then I'll turn the depth on our first cloud displacement down and its strength up just a little bit. Then I'll turn the strength of the marble displacement up as well. Then I'm going to add in another displacement. I'll hit new texture on this. I'll just leave it at clouds and turn its scale significantly down. The thing we are going to do different with this displacement is turn the contrast and the brightness both all the way up. This displacement will basically just add little holes in the mesh everywhere and break up all the smoothest areas of the lava. Then back on this displacement's settings under the modifiers tab, I'm going to turn its mid-level all the way up. If the mid-level is at 0.5, then 50% gray will not displace up or down. However, if you turn the mid-level all the way up to 1, then anything that is less than white will get pushed down. Then I'm going to turn the subdivision surface up to 4 just so I can see what's going on. I'll go ahead and turn the strength of this last displacement down a little more, and then go and turn its size down as well. This displacement should add one more little layer of detail. The next thing I'm going to do is copy our subdivision surface. I had the render divisions cranked all the way up to 6, however that wasn't high enough. That way I will have 7 subdivisions instead of 6 in our render. And one thing that I would like to note is that every time you add a new displacement, you should have a reason. You should be looking at a reference image and see, oh, this part of the mesh needs that kind of displacement. Don't just go adding displacements randomly without looking at reference images. Anyways, here I am making the 4096 by 4096 ambient occlusion map that I should have made at the start. Then I'll go back and select it in the node editor. Then I'm going to go ahead and bake this ambient occlusion map at 32 samples. And after some more time, we got this map, which is now high enough resolution, and we are ready to continue building our lava shader. So hitting Shift Z in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, again I'm going to begin adjusting the material. I'm going to start by adjusting the color ramps up here. The next thing I'm going to do is add in a texture, noise texture. Then I'm going to grab a color ramp and plug that noise texture into the color ramp. I'll pull the noise and the color ramp back. Basically, this noise texture is just going to break up the ambient occlusion map a little bit and add some areas that have cooled. So then I'm going to add a mix RGB and plug that in between the color ramp for the ambient occlusion and the color ramp for the noise texture. I'll set it to multiply and turn its factor all the way up to multiply these two together. I will Control-Shift-Click on the noise texture's color ramp and just turn up the contrast a bit. Basically what I'm doing is I'm just breaking up the shader a bit with this noise texture by adding some splotches here and there that have cooled off. I'm going to switch back to the 3D view and I'm going to add some depth of field. While in the view of the camera, I'm going to place my cursor on the mesh wherever it is that I want to be in focus. Under the camera settings, I will check the limits checkbox and the aperture I will change to f-stop. Just change your distance value until the cross gets to the 3D cursor and that will be the area that is in focus. Change the aperture f-stop value down to something pretty low, like 0.2. And once you've got your depth of field set up, you're ready for another render. Go back to the UV image editor and hit render again. And this is what we got from that render, which is so much better. It's way closer to my end goal. However, now that we have that render, we can see that there are some things that we need to change. The first thing that I'm going to change is back in the node editor. I am going to change the roughness on the principal shader a bit and just turn it up. Then I'm going to turn the darkness of this principal shader down quite a bit as well. Back in the node editor, as soon as I Control-Shift-Click on the ambient occlusion map, I notice that it has for some reason reset. This is kind of annoying. It's just Blender's way of saying you need to save your bake maps to the hard drive. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to switch back to the UV image editor, select our ambient occlusion map, and hit bake again. Then as soon as it's baked, I'm going to hit image and save as image so that it's on the hard drive and Blender doesn't, for whatever reason, reset it. And then I'm going to go back to the node editor and I'm going to open the ambient occlusion map that I saved to the hard drive. That way Blender doesn't reset it. So anyways, once I've got that, I am going to Control-Shift-Click on the noise texture node and adjust it a little bit. On the noise texture node, I'm going to turn the distortion up to 2 and the noise down to 6 and then just mess with the color ramp so that it's not quite as high contrast. The next thing I'm going to do is duplicate the color ramp that controls the color of the lava. I'm going to plug the mix RGB node into this color ramp and then Control-Shift-Click on it. Then plug the color ramp down into the color of the emission shader. Then I'm just going to hide the original color ramp and move it out of the way in case we ever need it again. What we're doing is just making sure that the color of the lava is affected by the noise texture and the ambient occlusion map. And then once we have that set up, I'm going to adjust all the color ramps so that they make sense with each other and finish our lava shader up. And pretty much by this stage, it's just tweaking to get things exactly right. I'll go ahead and turn the Musgrave bump map strength up a bit, and then switch back to the UV image editor, and we are going to prepare for a final render. I'm going to check the previous render result just to see what else I need to change. And it doesn't look like there's anything to change, so I'm going to do another render. This is what we got from that render, which is a whole lot better than both of the renders before it. I do notice that there is some texture stretching going on. However, that doesn't seem to be a problem. In fact, it makes it look like the lava is sort of liquid and stretching around in there, which I actually really like the look of. So I guess by definition, that makes that a happy accident. The other thing I'm going to do is turn on Filmic color management. I don't usually use this as I don't usually find it necessary. However, in this situation, Filmic I think is going to be useful. I'm going to do a couple last tweaks by turning the Musgrave Lacudinary to something like 1.48. I'll then turn the bump node up just a little bit to something like 0.6. I'll switch back to the UV image editor and make the render samples 64. And then I'm going to go and turn on denoising. I'll set this down to 0.25 so we don't get too much denoising. If denoising is too high, it does sometimes cause artifacts. Next, I'm going to turn the resolution up to 120% of 1920 by 1080. You don't have to do this, but I usually render my images higher than 1920 by 1080 just so that when I crush them back down to 1920 by 1080, they're sharper. So this is what I got from that render, which I think looks pretty good. At this point, I really am liking the stretching effects that are going on. It makes the lava look sticky or not quite as fluid, maybe. Overall, the scene is looking really nice and stands on its own pretty well without post-processing. However, post-processing always takes an image that lasts a little bit. So I'm going to save the image out and do my post-processing in After Effects. You do not have to use Adobe software or paid software or After Effects or anything like that. You could use GIMP or you could use Blender and just do it right inside of Blender. However, it's about creating art. So yeah, just use whatever software you want to do the compositing, and you should have something that looks like this, which is pretty cool. Again, I should say I went for a little redder of a color than I've seen in lava. I did another render at 250% of 1920 by 1080 just so that I could get some real sharp details and zoom in and get some close-ups in the video. The ambient occlusion map at 4096 turned out to be high enough resolution, even for a render at 250% of 1920 by 1080. Anyways, that's basically it. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time. This is Iridesium. Never mind.